Now, you cannot talk about world history and culture without substantial reference to Arabia and to Islam. We'll get to the Islamic faith itself in a moment, but I just want to highlight for a second that throughout the history of the world, again, the Arabian Peninsula is not far from the Fertile Crescent. There have been people there for millennia. I've actually been doing research for a video on Uncharted 3, which is not a good resource on learning about Arabia, but they did make passing reference to a people called the Sabaeans, who were like an Arabian culture, contemporary kind of with like ancient Greece and Rome. They're not on here, but there has been a little bit of attention and scholarship paid to the period of Arabian history just before the rise of Islam. There was basically a tribal, nomadic, polytheistic culture of a sort that dominated the Arabian Peninsula leading up to the time when the Prophet Muhammad was born, for example. And we actually still do have some of the poetry and writings from these people. Poetry was very central to their culture, so perhaps that's not surprising. Antara ibn Shaddad is a poet whose books you can just get an English translation of, just like the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library exists as a good scholarly source, kind of like the Laob Classical Library for ancient Greece and Rome. There is this Library of Arabic Literature, which has a similar level of scholarly merit to it. It's a great resource for learning about this kind of stuff. There's a poet called Al-Mutanabi, who is, one of the most important poets in the Arabic language. Adonis, who is a living poet, he's very old, but he's actually still alive, is also a highly respected poet who writes in Arabic. Of course, there was a time when Baghdad was the cultural center of the world. This was around, the Middle Ages, around like the 1300s, give or take. This book, The Ultimate Ambition in the Arts of Erudition, a compendium of knowledge from the classical Islamic world, is a little bit kind of like an encyclopedia from, the Islamic Golden Age, give or take. But the most central text in Arabic is obviously the Quran. There's an event known as the Hijra, when the Prophet Muhammad and his early followers migrated from Mecca to Medina. This event is known as the Hijra, and a little bit like the birth of Jesus for Christians, it serves as the beginning of the Islamic calendar. So this happened in 622 CE or AD. So in the Islamic calendar today, the year 2025 is the year 1447 AH, which I believe means after the Hijra. And of course, I do have a very limited knowledge of all this stuff, but I'm really motivated to learn more about it because every piece of information that I do learn about it is completely fascinating to me, in part because it's just completely novel and completely new. Nobody in the country, Canada, where I grew up, saw fit to mention any of this at all to me. So I find it really, really fascinating to learn about this stuff, especially since I find the vast majority of it to be incredibly beautiful. One thing I have tried to read very briefly is one of the collections of Hadith. The Hadith literature is a tradition of compilations of sayings from the Prophet Muhammad other than the Quran. There are traditions of recording and compiling the various things that he said to his followers throughout the course of his life, which are secondarily to the Quran seen as a great source of wisdom, and they've had a tremendous impact on Islamic history and culture. There's also a rich history of philosophy, again, partially centering around the Islamic Golden Age, around Baghdad. Philosophers like Ibn Rushd or Averroes and Ibn Sina or Avicenna are central also to European philosophy. Thomas Aquinas was very familiar with them, very inspired by them. Al-Ghazali is another very important and famous philosopher. And then you have mystical writings and poetry in the following centuries as well. This is an entire tradition of learning and poetry and storytelling and epics and everything else. We talked about Persia before and leading up to Islam. So after Islam, Persia is, of course, continued to be an incredibly important and beautiful culture. Remember, Ferdowsi was talking about the pre-Islamic world, though still being a Muslim himself. But after this, you still have many great poets and philosophers. Nizami Ganjavi was, another central genius poet from, I believe, actually Azerbaijan. And he decided that since Ferdowsi had already written epics about the great kings, right? He had already written like the Iliad and Odyssey of Persia. He was going to turn his talents to romance and love. And so he wrote epic poems about these famous, folk tales and myths centering around romantic relationships, tying it to Sufi and Muslim beliefs and spirituality. I've read Layli and Majnun. It's an absolutely beautiful epic poem about Layli or Layla and Majnun, two lovers who can't be together. Rumi's Masnavi is perhaps one of the most central, most famous works of poetry in actually like world history. Attar's Conference of the Birds was on the previous slide. There's also an important moment in the history of Persia where this guy, Shah Ismail, if I'm saying this correctly, conquered Persia and started its conversion from a Sunni to a Shia Muslim country. He commissioned an epic poem about his exploits, not so differently to how, for example, Augustus would have asked Virgil to create an epic legitimizing his reign. This book is called the Shahnameh Shah Ismail, or similar things to that. To my knowledge, it hasn't really been compiled or translated in form that we can really easily access. I'd have to do more research about that, but I still want to highlight it just to kind of show like not every important, or at least attempted important epic poem has come down to us in a Penguin Classics edition that we can just easily consume. One of the most important philosophers in the history of, certainly in the recent history of Islam and Iran, is Mullah Sadra. If you want to read about Mullah Sadra in English, I think that for the most part you just have to read secondary sources on him. I don't think there are at least very many complete, reliable scholarly English translations of his actual works. But even these secondary sources may, in some respects be useful. Here's a secondary source called The Persianate World by Niall Green, The Frontiers of a Eurasian Lingua Franca. Just like how Rome and Great Britain had big empires that spread their language across the world, Persia has also had empires, and it has spread its language around both east and west from the Eurasian steppe, from the Iranian plateau, probably north as well. Then we have India.